Today we're breaking down one of the sharpest openings in chess, the fried liver attack. Let's see how this aggressive line can put your opponent's king under fire right from the start. We start with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and then bishop to c4. So here we go. White has just played bishop to c4, aiming directly at the potentially weak square f7. Now black has two main options. Either play knight to f6, which is the most common move leading to the two knights game, or bishop to c5, which heads into the Italian game. Both choices have their pros and cons. Knight to f6 allows white to immediately jump in with knight to g5, putting pressure on the pawn at f7, and that's the fried liver attack we'll be talking about in a moment. On the other hand, bishop to c5 avoids that plan. From c5, the bishop helps the queen control the g5 square, so white cannot go there safely. The queen would capture the knight, and since there is no knight blocking on f6, the queen's control is clear. That said, the Italian game has its own dangers. White can go for pawn to c3 followed by pawn to d4, striking the center and attacking both the pawn on e5 and the bishop on c5. This position can quickly become complicated and risky for black, with lots of theory to know. That's why many players, especially at lower rating levels, prefer the simpler knight to f6. Even though it allows white to play knight to g5 and threaten the f7 pawn, it feels natural and easier to remember than the subtleties of the Italian game. From here, black must deal with the threat. The most common response you'll see is pawn to d5, defending against the attack. There are some tricky sidelines like knight takes e4 or bishop takes c5, leading to counter gambits, but those require precise knowledge. So at most levels, pawn to d5 is the natural and expected defense. Now white captures on d5, and here's the surprising twist. The move that looks like the most natural response, the move almost everyone would play, turns out to be a deadly mistake. That move is knight takes d5. Spoiler alert, stronger players often go for knight to a5 instead. That line leads to a much more balanced position. White usually responds with bishop to b5 check, and after that the game remains roughly equal. Just normal play without anything dramatic. But let's rewind. In most games, black will indeed go for the obvious knight takes d5, simply recapturing the pawn white just took. At first glance it looks logical, safe, and even strong for black. However, this opens the door to the famous fried liver attack. White strikes with knight takes f7, and suddenly the game is collapsing for black. White not only captures the pawn, but also attacks both the queen and the rook at the same time. Black is forced to capture the knight. From there, white continues energetically with queen to f3, giving check to the king while also attacking the knight on d5, which is now targeted twice. So what can black do here? If they simply chicken out and move the king away from danger, things collapse instantly. No matter which square the king runs to, white just captures the knight on d5 and the attack continues without mercy. For example, if black plays king to e8, white responds with bishop takes d5, and now there are deadly threats everywhere. Queen to f7 and bishop takes c6 are both hanging over black's head. The position is hopeless. If instead the king retreats back to g8, that is even worse. After bishop takes d5, white's threats come with check, and it quickly leads to a forced checkmate. Black can delay it for a move or two, but the king is trapped with no way out. That's why the most resilient choice for black is to be bold and play king to e6. It looks extremely risky, leaving the king exposed in the center, but at least this move defends the knight on d5. Black stays a piece up for the moment and hopes to weather the storm. But survival here is only temporary. Since the knight on d5 is pinned to the king and already under attack, white adds more pressure with knight to c3. Now the threat of bishop takes d5 check, or simply piling on with additional captures, becomes overwhelming, and black is once again in serious trouble. At this point, black might try to defend the knight in different ways, which we'll cover shortly. But there is also a very common mistake you'll see in practice. Knight to d4. This move has been played in thousands of games, so chances are you'll run into it at some point. The idea is that black counterattacks your queen while also threatening the pawn on c2. From there, the knight would be forking your king and your rook, which can look scary if you are not prepared. If you panic here, it's easy to go wrong and lose your advantage. The correct response is simple. Bishop takes d5, delivering check to the king. This is key because black now has no time to capture your pieces. The king must move, and you are also threatening to penetrate with queen to f7. The safest and really the only square for the king is d6, but white plays queen to f7 anyway, keeping the attack rolling and ignoring the c2 pawn because the checkmate threat is far more important. Now in most cases your opponent will see the tempting knight takes c2, forking your king and your rook, and they'll grab it without hesitation. You calmly play king to d1, letting them take the rook. But once they do, knight to a4 is checkmate. The king has nowhere to run. Pretty cool, right? After the check, the queen covers these key squares, the knight controls the remaining escape square, and it all comes together as a clean checkmate. This is one of the most common ways you can win with the fried liver attack. Now let's move on to the main line. The toughest defense black can try. The knight on d5 is under massive pressure, and black has to defend it somehow. There are two main ways to do this, either knight to e7 or knight to b4. Knight to e7 does technically defend the knight on d5, but the problem is that it blocks the bishop and the queen. The knight just sits there passively, not contributing much. Knight to b4, on the other hand, also defends the knight on d5, but does so in a more active way. That's why knight to b4 is considered the stronger defensive resource in this position. Even though knight to b4 is stronger than knight to e7, it still comes with problems. Yes, it defends the knight on d5, but from b4 it also threatens the pawn on c2. That makes it look dangerous. But in reality, it is not as scary as it seems. Should we worry about the pawn on c2? No, not really. White can simply castle here. You are going to castle anyway to finish development, and this move also sidesteps any potential check if the knight jumps in. The important detail is that black cannot actually move the knight away from b4 because it must continue defending the knight on d5. If black gets greedy and tries knight takes c2, that immediately backfires. Bishop takes d5 comes with check, and soon the attack crashes through, black loses the knight, loses the king's safety, and the position falls apart completely. So let's step back. Since knight takes c2 is not really an option, black is left with only one way to keep things together, pawn to c6. Without this move, white is threatening to play pawn to a3, driving away the knight from b4, and then simply capturing the knight on d5. That's why pawn to c6 is forced here. This position used to be considered complicated and unclear in the old days. Yes, black's king is very exposed, but black still holds on to the extra knight, and for a long time this line was even played at the grandmaster level. Nowadays, thanks to modern engines, the mystery is gone. We know that white is simply winning. The plan is straightforward. Target the exposed king. That is the key weakness in black's position. The way to do it is by pushing pawn to d4. This opens the e-file directly toward the king. Since black's knight on d5 is pinned, their king is centralized and their other pieces are undeveloped. Everything is stacked against them. Suppose black tries to fight back with knight takes c2, counterattacking your king and rook. It looks aggressive, but white ignores it. The priority is to open the center and keep the attack going. Even if black captures the rook on a 1, white keeps piling on pressure against the knight on d5. Soon, black is overwhelmed. The knight on d5 cannot be defended any longer. Once white captures it, the position collapses. Bishop takes d5 comes with check, and now the king has no safe escape. If the king runs to e6, your rook is waiting on the d-file. If the king tries e7, which is the most common move, queen to f7 ends the game instantly with checkmate. That's the essence of the fried liver attack, a simple plan that relentlessly punishes black for stepping into danger. The king in the center cannot survive once white opens the lines. Thanks for watching. I hope you understand all these variation. If you found this video is helpful, then like and subscribe. See you in the next one.